here. The great thing about these presentations, you can be here live. You can watch it live stream through the internet. And we also are archiving all these programs.
To be captioned in Spanish and in English. So those are up usually a week after each event. So thank you for coming. With no further ado, I would like to introduce our moderator, Cook Fesperman, a history and political science instructor here at IVCC. We have David Giuliani from The Times, Jenna Dooley from WNIJ, and Jeff Dankert from the Tribune. So thank you so much for coming, and I hope you enjoy. We will have an hour presentation with a 30-minute question and answer session after. Thank you.
Welcome everyone, and thank you again for coming up to IVCC for the Noise versus News program. I'm going to get started by asking questions. I did send most of the questions ahead of time, but I'm going to start with a question that I didn't send them. You always got to have that gotcha moment in journalism, right? So I'll be asking questions, and then the panelists can just sort of take turns, or if somebody gets like two out there, then we'll sort of maybe go round robin or something. But the first question that I have for you, and I think it's a good one, is where do you get your news from?
I read the Chicago Tribune every single day, pretty comprehensively. I read the paper I work for, the Times, and then there's other publications like Time Magazine. I read that pretty thoroughly. I read Columbia Journalism Review when it only comes out, what, 2 times a year now. I read regional products, the News Tribune in LaSalle. I read that. And I read lots of things online. So those are the main publications I drive a lot, so I listen to radio. I listen to news stations, public radio, and so I pay attention to news all the time.
I get a lot from Twitter. I actually am not a Facebook user anymore. There's a little too much noise for me. We'll talk about later. I follow a lot of other journalists on Twitter. I follow Dave, and I kind of like it from the horse's mouth. So before he even publishes a story on his Twitter feed, I kind of know what's going into his story because he does a lot of live tweeting sometimes. Our listening area is regional, so we go north to Janesville, south to the area we're at right now. We go all the way just up near the Mississippi River and the outskirts of Aurora. So there's a lot of local newspapers to follow. A lot of times the way I kind of do is I read after the fact analysis sometimes. Columbia Journalism Review, I like to read Pointer, is a great publication. It's kind of like if a story didn't get it right, it explains why. Pointer is a great resource, and even Lab is a great resource. And honestly, as far as news, I have the guilty pleasure of I do celebrity gossip stuff all the time. So even though I'm not on Facebook, I go to people.com and Entertainment Weekly and all those things. So I do a mix of, I would say, business and pleasure is how I get my news.
Yeah, I consume most of my news on the internet today. It used to be more print, but our newsroom gets most of the regional newspapers, the local newspapers, state newspapers, some of the national newspapers, which I'll browse and print, but most of it's online. And I'll start with the news feed, some news feed is usually when we start. It might even be a local news feed. But that will usually get spin off into some area, maybe nationally, maybe locally. Yeah, so I do consume some of social media links.
Just as a follow-up question, I noticed that none of you had mentioned any television news. Any reason why?
I don't want to mention, I really kind of focus on print media and the media around here, but I don't watch a lot. Sometimes on YouTube I'll watch some CNN, Fox News. I'll go through the YouTube, the ones they suggest on Fox News and CNN. I like to do both of those. I do a little bit of MSNBC, but mainly I like to get kind of a feel for those two nationally, what they're saying, and you get 2 different perspectives from them.
I will at times sit down in the 6 o'clock, 7 o'clock, or 5 to 6 period and watch some TV, local and national. And then some of the times I'm consuming national news online, which will come with a video. I might watch the video, which is usually a summary of the bigger story.
Yeah, I would say probably by the time that I would watch, I'm on the air at 6 o'clock, so I'd watch it at 10. By then, I kind of am done consuming for the day. So it's just the day-to-day part of it. When I get home, I kind of will still keep following maybe my Twitter account, but just the sensory overload, it's not that I think local TV and national TV, I think they do a lot of really good things, but I probably see it maybe in the clip the next day online.
So I think it's fair to say that you are all mainstream news. So do people who read mainstream news, can they trust you? Or
Yes,
consume it?
I think relatively they can. And I think I can speak for all of us in this environment that mainstream journalism has an intention of delivering you a story with the facts, an accurate reflection of reality, with the things you want to know about that story. I think every journalist here and elsewhere is trying to do that every day.
I think the extra commitment is one of the things I've run into over the last couple of years as social media has gotten bigger is it's scope and scale. Scope and scale always goes through my head. If I'm out in the field and there's a tornado that's gone through, on social media, it's the biggest tornado that's ever happened of all time. And there's dark cloud pictures, and you're like, oh my gosh, pray for the people there and there, which is because it's happening now. And there's all these images, and it's and I think sometimes those are newsworthy events, and we're there and we're covering them. But in that moment, we lose scope and scale. We don't know how big is this event. How wide was this tornado? We don't know. Is it an EF2 yet? We don't know fatalities yet. Things like that. And so when you have a severe weather thing, there's Joplin, Missouri was one thing, and then there's what's happening now. And I look at trying to provide context at the time. With social media, when you're reporting, you lose some of that, but you're consuming it. Sometimes that scope and scale doesn't come till later. What I try to do as mainstream is try to provide that as much as possible. I think one other example I would give is a state budget. So let's say Illinois passes a state budget. Well, you need to know that there hasn't been a budget for 22 months. So yes, the news of the event is there is a state budget passed, but that's just one event happening. What is that immediate context that I can give you? Why should you care? Well, for 22 months there hasn't been one. And so that's why I think in the mainstream, the difference is, yes, we want to get it out, and we want to be, it is nice to be the first person, you obviously want to be accurate, but I think the mainstream takes one step back to give you maybe the tweet between the headline, an extra tweet or an extra paragraph to put it in context. I would hope that's what I'm trying to do.
Yeah, I mean, yes, I think people can trust us. I mean, do we have bias? Yes. Every human has bias. I mean, what we choose to put on our front page reflects biases of our life experiences. But what we're trying to do is recognize those biases and minimize it as much as possible. I mean, even in the words you choose, make sure, like, if you're going to say the state senator said, or should I say the state senator claimed? Well, claim, yeah, that sounds kind of like, well, question what the state senator said is always better. So we gotta put our biases in check, and we're humans. Every human has them just through life experiences. Do we make mistakes? 100%, absolutely. I'm testament to that. We do make mistakes. One prominent mistake that happened in the White House at the beginning of Trump's term was a reporter wrote that there was no Martin Luther King bust in the Oval Office, and a lot of people said that was fake news. No, that was not fake news. That was a mistake. Definitely, no, 100% that was a mistake. Martin Luther King bust was still there. It wasn't a totally concocted story, which is what fake news is. So yes, we make mistakes, but we correct it when we do, or we should, and we know how to minimize and keep in check our biases.
Yeah, that bus story, you can go online and find the backstory of how hard that reporter was working that story. He didn't just take somebody's comment and run. He was really working on that story. So somewhere online you can find the reporter's story, how that evolved. And they were really working hard and they in there and then worked really hard to correct it. That's the difference between journalism and mainstream journalism and the people who are throwing out fake evidence. There's a vast difference.
So can you tell us more about the specific things you do to ensure journalistic integrity?
I can. In our newsroom, and pretty much it reflects every newsroom, or most newsrooms, is that, we're always questioning each other, like, did you get this source? Did you get this side? Did you get the public documents to back that up? We do a lot of public records requests, because that's better than just somebody saying something. So, I don't know how many times I hear in our newsroom, what about this person? Why don't you call this person? I think that's good, because maybe somebody will bring something to light that you didn't think of. So that's some of what we do in our newsroom, and I'm sure that reflects other newsrooms.
There's two basic tests that I guess beginning journalists use that go through my head all the time, and I've probably heard one of the things is, if your mother says she loves you, check it out. And so that's something that's always told, even if your mom says she loves you, check it out. The other one is the smell test. And so the smell test is if you've got a carton of milk in your refrigerator and it says it's going to expire in a week, and you open it up and it's like, whoa, it's bad. Is it expired? Well, the date says it's not, but man, it doesn't smell good. The smell test is it's not right. So if someone tells you something and they're a public official and they tell you something and it does not pass the smell test, either that's an error on their part or you need to back it up with something else. You don't just do it again because if your mother says you love her. Those are the two basic tests. And we also, I think as far as journalistic integrity, trust should not be assumed. I trust myself and the people who I interact with a lot. So if it's the mayor, he interacts with me a lot, probably. There's a trust, a built-up trust. If I'm interacting with a member of the public for the first time, I need to explain what I'm doing. I shouldn't assume that they trust me just because I'm with the media. I think about it in terms of the bedside manner. If you're going to get a dental appointment and you don't go very often, you'd sure like it if the dentist kind of explains to you, here's what's going to happen. Again, if you need to pause and take a break or regather your thoughts. And so I think that's a change I've done in the last year or two, is if I'm dealing with members of the public, I'm going and saying, they don't have to talk to me. Why should they have to talk to me? I need to go up to them and show them the value of me telling a story does nothing. If they open up to me, they can share that story with a much wider audience, And so that's why I think with the integrity comes is not assuming trust.
Yeah, integrity covers a lot. I mean, it's balance, and it's everything, almost, it captures everything we try to do. So, I mean, David mentioned bias. Everybody has a bias. All reporters have biases. I can remember Jim Lehrer being asked, or his effort to remove his bias was so strong that he told people he didn't vote. And there was, that he just wouldn't go into the ballot box. But then Sam Donaldson, he was an old TV journalist. He made the point that Lehrer knows how he would have voted. So really, he's carrying around his bias. So either way, you're carrying around bias in front of your life, and it's important you just set those aside, and you know when they're creeping in, and you remove them as best you can.
Or the public will let you know about them. I mean, there's also checks and balances with the public, and they will let you know if a story is leaning one way or the other, or if they perceive that it's leaning one way or the other.
That's the advantage of Facebook.
Engage in it.
Yeah, and I think with sources, you have to treat them in a way that, I treat sources differently. The public, you're right, they have no obligation. You folks have no obligation to tell me anything. Public officials, there's a greater liability on them to say something, to provide information.
I'm just wondering though, if we're sort of taking bias and we're making it to say, well, everybody has bias, which is true, I agree. And then saying, but we try to set that aside. But do you feel as if the public perceives your particular news outlets to be biased in one direction or the other? Because I can tell you what I hear is that the Times and the Trib have a conservative bias, and that NPR has a liberal bias. So how do you respond to
I
that?
can address that. Our paper used to be called the Daily Republican, so no secrets there. A lot of papers around the country were very partisan organs at one time. And you can see that names of newspapers around the country, including here. We do get that charge on, that we get the charge more often probably conservative than liberal because of that history. And also, people think the owner is conservative in that kind of thing. I've never met the owner of our company. It's only a few newspapers, but that doesn't really play a role in the newsroom. I mean, professional journalists our role is not to wonder what the owner is thinking or what the owner's bias is, but we have to cover a story and call it like it is. So, yeah, we get the charge, and I think it's fair for the public to assess whether we're conservative or liberal. I think we need to be aware of what people are thinking, and like I said, Facebook is good for that, because people will tell you, if they think you have a bias in your story, they will tell you on Facebook. And so that's kind of the history of our organization, why we get that charge.
Yeah, people are going to think what they're going to think, and they're going to go to the sources that they think. I mean, you ask what we follow, everyone follows their own sources. I would say, as far as a bias, I don't wake up in the morning saying, how can I further this agenda? I'm one person at the local level. Anytime you have an organized group of people, someone's going to try to attribute a trend to them. But at the same time, the people I interact with, as a reporter, I kind of go back to, we're each a different individual, and we are trying to better the civic good, and there are going to be some bad actors. And I believe there's enough checks and balances in the mainstream media to weed those out.
Yeah, I think media institutions, if you look at the ownership, they're conservative. And I think studies have shown that the ownership of different media outlets are conservative, whereas the reporters might be liberal if you were to ask them. But our paper gets accused of being conservative and liberal. And we get it both ways. And it depends on what story the person's reading that day. If you did a study, you'd want to look at, studies tell you the true picture, and those are hard to get at sometimes. It's just, yeah, I can tell you that you don't, if you guys could see what goes on this side of the wall, you might be a little surprised. I guess this is really, this kind of forum is to break through that. You don't see any agenda making. You don't see a secret cabal. I got that accusation again today.
Oh,
You guys are meeting, playing favors to politics. It just doesn't work that way.
But you're talking about ownership. With public radio, if you don't know the funding structure, we receive a good portion of our funding structure directly from listeners. And so we do those fund drives, those pledge drives, people answering the phones, you see that on public TV and public radio. So we are accountable to the public, and we do hear that when people give their dollars when they feel like we're fair and balanced, and we get those in the comments. We're not a commercial radio station, so if there's an election, a lot of commercial stations, they get money for candidates. We don't get that revenue source. Our license is held by Northern Illinois University, so we do receive some Arts Council funding and some funding from the Corporation for Public Broadcasting. Sometimes you'll hear that, and you'll say, the government wants to kill Big Bird. Because, yeah, there is stations across the country do receive funding from different sources. The big bulk of what we get does come from listeners. Our license is held by a university, which is the case for a lot of public radio universities, but we have a firewall between our newsroom and any administration at the university. So we are not told, we're not a mouthpiece for the university. If we have to report on a hiring or a firing, there's no one telling us we can or can't report on that. Sometimes we will do a disclaimer. If it's a story that very much involves the university, we might say at the end, the station is owned by and licensed to the university, just to have that added level of transparency. But I certainly have never ever had a university administrator or president come to my office and say, how dare you write that story, or why were you looking into those numbers, or that report didn't make us look very good, can you just maybe not put that. I personally have never had that, and I've worked within 2 university systems in the state of Illinois. One other thing I would add is we do receive some corporate support. So you ever hear a support for program, it comes from Dr. So-and-so or Dr. So-and-so. Every once in a while, there might be a coincidence where maybe a theater group has purchased underwriting, and our news team was going to do a story about that. So maybe we were going to do, our arts reporter was going to say, hey, well, this looks like an interesting play they're doing. We're going to go to a rehearsal, I'm going to interview people. But those are separate decisions. There's never an underwriting person saying, hey, they bought some time, can you do a story on it? It's only if there's a news judgment decision, and then if we find out that they're an underwriter, then we have a disclaimer at the end to say, you know, you just heard this story, this entity is an underwriter of the station. Again, there's transparency, but to be clear, we're never told do this story because this entity has paid for the station.
I think there's been a lot of talk about being fair and balanced, and not just from Fox News. And I think part of what's going on is that there's a real push for balance to mean fair. And as a result, we've ended up with a lot of false equivalencies. How do you perceive that difference between fair and balanced?
Well, I wrote a story about climate change, what was it about? I think it was last fall. And I felt no obligation to find somebody who didn't believe it. I just wrote about, I talked to the state climatologists and presented how it was going to affect Illinois. I think that's what you're trying to get at. I could have went out and found somebody to dispute what the state climatologist was saying, what the evidence said. I don't think that serves the reader there.
Why not?
Because it would just confuse them. If they believe that there's some doubt that scientists for 20, 30 years have been tracking this. I mean, there's plenty of arguments within the scientific community about climate change. You know, I think those can be reported. But that brings up somebody, I think the professor last week was trying to remember the author's name, who's written the book, The Death of Expertise. It was Tom Nichols. He's making the rounds now. And I haven't bought the book, but I read some of his excerpts, and he's on a speaking tour. Finding him online talking about this. And experts are not, they're not trusted, you know, like they used to be. People who have spent time studying these, studying that or this. And, you know, one person on a blog challenged them.
Well, fair and balanced, they are separate things. If there's a protest down at the Capitol and 300 people come and they've got signs saying "down with cursive" or something like that, which is actually a real thing. Down with cursive, okay?
My son's behind you.
Yeah, okay. Let's say there's 300 protesters in the rotunda and they've got all these signs, and there's one person in the corner saying, "Keep cursive alive." Okay, so balance would be me, the reporter, talking to one of the protesters and that one supporter. But is that fair? That doesn't put the context. It goes back to that scope and scale. My job as a reporter to say, okay, I've presented both sides, but to be clear, there were hundreds of opponents to cursive today at the Capitol, and so I've created I'm making it fair to give the audience a visual of what really happened, because the opponents might have been mobilized. They're there because they're a common cause. What I can't see in my audience is how many people really are for and against. I can't do a test of that. So that's why it is important for an issue like that to present both sides, but also give context of just what is the difference in the playing field in that particular event I'm covering.
Yeah, I think subjective topics like that, like, you know, should we be writing cursive, or should we the death penalty? We're still struggling with the abortion issue. I think there's no clear, you know, there's not a scientific study that said, yep, we should be aborting babies, or a scientific study that said, no, we should. It's really our social opinion. We're still struggling with that. I think in that case, you get both sides more than you would, say, on a story on evolution, which is a done deal and has been for 50 years. Unless you're covering the anti-evolution group, then you're going to get the votes.
So we were talking before, and of course this is about noise versus news. So what is fake news? How do you define it?
I define it as concocted stories. I mean, I'll give you just one example. It's not, you know, news. I mean, when I was first asked this forum, this was I think around February, maybe January, and this whole idea of fake news being news you don't like or that makes you angry. I think there's a certain president who reacts to things, fake news, fake news. Fake news is not news you don't like, or even news that might be inaccurate. Maybe somebody tried to be accurate, but they were off, or news is biased, maybe. It's really just totally concocted stories. I'll give you one example. Last year, there's a report that First Lady Michelle Obama's mother will receive a $160,000 annual government pension. Actually, somebody put this on one of my Facebook friends, put this on there and said, "This is outrageous. How does anybody support this?" I said, "No, I wouldn't support it, but it's not true." She's not receiving the pension. She's the mother-in-law for, you know, the president's mother-in-law. That's crazy. It just does not. It's not true. And you know, for the other side, there was a story making the rounds of the internet. Ben Carson, argues his experience in separating twins and denying evolution is exactly what qualifies me to serve as HUD head. He's head of the HUD, Housing and Urban Development. That was untrue, but people who are on that, who don't like Carson, don't like Trump, they're going to, I'm going to put that on Facebook. They're weak. They put that on. And the other thing, Obama's mother-in-law is going to be taking all this money from the government. This got to be true. That's fake news. They're totally concocted stories. What Trump is refers to as fake news is not fake news.
Yeah, I think there's fake news and there's fabricated news. And I was at a gathering of news broadcasters this weekend down at the University of Illinois, and a professor there said, stop using fake news, it only legitimizes it. I think the issue with a blanket term like fake news is it offers no specificity of what the issue is, and it offers no solution on how you can solve it. So fabricated news is something someone made out of thin air that they somehow want to monetize or get their 15 minutes of fame. With fake news, it's just an effort to provide a blanket term. I think what would be more helpful instead of using fake news would be to say, yeah, that's inaccurate, that was plagiarism, that was fabrication, that was misleading, that was taken out of context. Then I think the good actors, the good reporters, can make a correction. Otherwise, fake news will never be, it'll be fake news in perpetuity. There's no solution with that term.
Yeah, I know some of the other episodes of this series you had to go talk about fake news, but in essence it's just news that's completely made up whole cloth, maybe with a graph photo, and it's not, none of it's true, and the whole, it comes down to intention. The intention wasn't to be informative or to be true. The intention was to make money off of clicks on the internet and to deceive. So that's what I meant when I said there's a wide gap. All the rest of journalism is trying to do a good job. They'll make mistakes, but it doesn't come close to the intention. And here to give you an idea of how deep the fake news generators think. One of them was coming out of the Republic of Georgia, the fake news maker. And they talked to him. Here's what he said. My audience likes Trump. This is a direct quote. My audience likes Trump. I don't want to write bad things about Trump. If I write fake stories about Trump, I lose my audience. That's as deep as it goes.
It's the motivation.
Yeah.
It's the motivation to dupe the public or to sway the public, and I don't think, as we've talked, that's not my motivation at the beginning of the day. The motivation is to inform the public to the best of my ability, not with my own knowledge, but bringing together people who can shed light on that and be the facilitator of that information.
Right.
And the solution is, if you see something like that on Facebook, even if you're like, oh, I believe that, that's horrible that Obama's doing that, or Trump is doing that, just take the headline, put it in Google, and then usually Snopes will come up and they'll say this is fake news or something else. If you don't see it in any of the mainstream outlets, I know we love to hate mainstream media, they're all corporate owned, but you know what? We like being competitive, and we like booking stories out there that are crazy. Like if Obama's mother-in-law was really getting a pension, the mainstream media would be all over that. That would be a huge story. Yeah. So if you just put it in Google and you don't see, if you see Snopes saying it's fake news, or you don't see other major outlets saying it's having a story about it, you haven't been duped yet, but don't post it on Facebook.
Yeah, my favorite headline was Pope Francis endorses Trump. But then I could have written down a whole list of them, but from this last episode. Here's another headline. True. Pope has died 22 times in 5 years. Now, here's a little twist. What year was that? 1903 in the United States. What newspaper? The Washington Post. The Pope has died 22 times in 5 years. Now we're going back into yellow journalism.
So I wonder though if everything is really that clear cut, if it's just fake news and mainstream news that you can trust. Where would you put Breitbart on that spectrum?
I don't really, that outlet obviously has a clear bias to support one side of the spectrum. And why are we going national on this? So why don't we just go to the local Illinois Valley Times? That's a paper, we don't need to go national, let's go right here local. That paper is certainly in this area, and still does occasionally, and there's a site, and the writers are from out of the area, and they have one purpose, is to support Republican candidates, and it presents itself as a newspaper that's like mainstream media. They say they hate mainstream media, those folks, but then they want to present themselves as such. I wouldn't mind if they said this is the Republican Party or the conservative opinion, but they don't really do that.
David, it's good you bring that up. Do you guys know what he's talking about? Do you see this Illinois Valley Times newspaper? Yeah, do they circulate? They circulate print editions.
They did a month or two ago.
Landing in
My coworkers
mailbox.
showed me a copy,
Yeah.
but I haven't seen it since then. But apparently, every once in a while, but they still have that online site.
Right.
It was put out by Liberty Principles, a political action committee
Yeah.
by a man named Dan Proft, who headed that organization.
Yeah.
Then somehow it slid into a for-profit company, but we never figured out how the assets are transferred, and boy, we did stories on it. I think your paper did stories on it. So that paper circulates, and that's kind of an example of Breitbart News also kind of presents itself. Well, I think Breitbart News is a little bit more forthright about what agenda they have. But this Illinois Times presents itself as a mainstream publication, where it's mainstream publication only seems to promote one side.
And they kind of sprinkle in some news briefs, local press releases to kind of give them legitimacy to the season about the library.
Right.
And then some other story. Edgar County Watchdog's website.
That was the one I was thinking
Yeah,
of.
they're kind of out there. I think Breitbart is, I'd call them biased, but boy, there's been some headlines that are just kooky, you don't even make me want to read the story. So I don't know.
Let's move on to talking about where you think the noise is coming from. And when I ask that question, it's sort of more like, why now? Why are we suddenly seeing such a surge in this noise, if you will?
Well, I think part of it is social media has amplified it. Just to a degree we've never seen before. If you think about the 1903 headline, that would have been read, you'd have to pick it up and then talk to somebody about it. That hits the internet and it just spreads like wildfire. I think that's part of the noise. And another part of it is we live in a country with free speech, you know. So while we try to tamp down the fake news and the false claims, we don't want to tamp down free speech. So in a country with free speech, it's noisy.
And noise has a negative connotation, obviously, that's kind of like a fly you want to swat away, or it's negative. You know, a couple of years ago, the big thing was engagement. You know, I know public radio stations are increasingly hiring engagement professionals to how do you work with your audience? How do you find out what's in the pulse? How do you get in touch with what people are really interested in? Engagement has a positive connotation. And so when I think about the noise, I think about, well, we've always wanted this. We've wanted a more direct engagement with our audience, and now we're getting it. The issue, I think, when it becomes noise is the motivation behind it. If someone hears a story and it mobilizes them to action, cool. But when you talk about the noise, it's someone who is either perpetuating fake news, or, you know, again, I hate using fake news, perpetuating a fabricated story, and is adding to that. But I'm with you, my job isn't to police that. I believe in the First Amendment. If it becomes threatening, then that's an issue, or, you know, that easier. But my job as a reporter is not to silence anybody. But I think you've got noise and you've got noise and you've got engagement, and sometimes they can be kind of gray on which one's which.
How about infotainment? How does Jon Stewart, it's not the John I wanted, I can never remember that. John Oliver, thank you. How does John Oliver, does that kind of take on the news make your job easier, harder?
Makes it more digestible. I mean, I certainly think I enjoy watching it. I learn something from it. Also, the big thing is what we talked about. They don't purport to be something that they're not. And I think there's a transparency in that. And so there is information, there's an entertainment value to it, but they're not pretending to be journalists either.
It was infotainment, that's like 20 years ago when they started using it. I think Stewart cracked through that whole thing, didn't he? I mean, I think he was the first person to say fake news was fake news. And then he got on, I think it was CNN's Crossfire, and lambasted him.
Oh, I love watching that clip.
Yeah, lambasted him for getting two talking heads with opposite ideas and going at each other for a half hour, hour and a half.
Hurting America, I think is how he put it.
Yeah. But then because he's not real, he can make all these allegations, but he won't hold himself. Well, I'm taking kind of retreat.
Well, I think what he said was that I'm a comedian.
Right.
Right. I mean, that's my job, is to entertain, and it's not really necessarily to inform, although it might happen, sort of along the way.
Yeah.
I think if it mobilizes curiosity and gets people to take an issue, I think there was one, John Oliver, one of his first big ones was about the Telecommunication Act or something, or FCC or something like that. It was enough of a spark and a nugget that then you can go to legitimate sources, but you wouldn't have even thought to Google that before. So I think that they can be used as a spark.
I think Stewart also he'd take something like somebody's record of making a claim. He loved hypocrisy, right? So they said this, let's go into the archives. And he could his team did that well, where he'd show a politician saying something, and then he'd go back 5 years and prop that up and show him saying this.
When we do that in our publications, the politician says one thing, and then we've done that with our congressman lately. The congressman said one thing when he was running, and then he said something later. Yeah, it should be reported. I mean, let the people know how the congressman is operating. I mean, of course, you could have done it with Abraham Lincoln too. He was not an abolitionist when he ran for president. Would have won if he was. So, but yeah, they do that in comedy. We do that in the newspaper too.
What do you do when you get it wrong to make it right? Because I think one of the criticisms that people levy is that when the newspaper runs or television runs a story that they got wrong, intentionally or unintentionally, it's front page, it's out there. Well, when they find out that it's wrong, do you really feel like the news industry is doing enough to correct that?
Well, yeah, I mean, I think if you find out new information, that happened to me this last year. We did a story on Frank Martino's pension, and we actually went to the pension system and said, with him and his Auditor General after a year, how much will he get? Because there's always stuff from conservative websites about how much he was going to get. I had an email, and they said exactly, the guy who was responsible for it said exactly what he was going to get. It was an email with a statement. It's exactly what he's going to get after a year about the pension. We did a first story, and we had a number of stories, that same information. Well, next, about 8 months later, we find out that, I forgot where I heard it from, but that the number they gave was wrong. And so I called the pension system, and the guy said, yeah, we were wrong. And he said, that's my fault. There was one nuance, and it wasn't that much higher. As they said, I think they said it was 55,000 higher. And so we did another story saying, well, this is the new information we have. And you should do that with a lot of things. I mean, sometimes, stories have an evolution. So you talk to the two sources, maybe you get a hold of a third source, but it was a big story and you thought you got all the sources you need, but another source comes later. Well, heck yeah, I mean, that source is critical to the story. You should do another story. You should say it's over with.
And with respect to broadcast, we are respectful of the day part when people hear it. So if there was an issue that happened during the 4 o'clock news, obviously we would do the correction in the next logical break. If I read the 4 o'clock news, oh shoot, that's not the person's name. Do a correction after that, and then we could give respect to the next day at that time, at 4 o'clock, because that's when that particular audience, we have high turnover when people listen. An example I can think of, this week there was a race up in Rockford. It was a write-in school board candidate race, and it ended up being a tie. And so in Illinois, you have to do either flip a coin or do highest card to determine the tie. So there was a highest card, and we had a reporter who was up there and was feeding back pictures and calling in so that I could get it onto the newscast. And she sent me a picture and said, oh, the cards are out. And there was a queen of clubs and 4 of hearts or something like that. And so I started writing it. I'm like, oh shoot, I'm going on in a minute. Okay, so-and-so wins it with the queen of spades. And right before I went on, I read out loud, it's like, oh shoot, it was the queen of clubs. I'm like staring at this card, and you're under deadline and stuff like that. So obviously it wasn't intentional. But that particular one, if I would have gone on air and said that, then you do the correction. If you've got a web post, then you need to do a correction. If people have retweeted that Twitter that has the inaccuracy in that, that's the difference now, I think, is if I make a mistake on air, it doesn't just go away, poof, oh, no, we can find a paper trail on it. We've got tweets, we've got Facebook posts, and we've got web posts that are all in their little tentacles going out that we can then have to try to call back. And so the way we do it is own up to the mistake, be considerate of the day part, and also be immediate with the clarification, or correct, or straight up correction.
Yeah, we write a correction as soon as we discover it. And just write the correction and publish it in the paper. If the correction is such that it's such a prominent thing, it might demand a story, a follow-up story, correcting the previous story, and making it prominent enough in the paper that people can see it. If you misspell a name, or the Queen of Hearts thing, or the dog's name was Timmy instead of Johnny, it's just a standard correction, right? And not a lot of weight there. To a reporter, I will tell you that nothing ruins our day more. And it can be the Queen of Hearts thing that can ruin your day.
Right.
Yeah.
That's all it takes. You get a dog's name wrong, that'll ruin my day.
Yeah, that's true.
And that's all it takes. And that, it could be the smallest little thing. The big ones really, I ruin your month. But
We're sensitive.
right, and you don't want to get anything wrong. We go to great pains not to. I mean, editing a story, really, if your first draft and you're going through it, and I think these guys can relate to this, the thing you're doing is taking out the things that you're not sure about. Or you make a call to make sure you know what you're doing.
Yeah, I was doing a story and I looked over it so many times, and I was just like, oh, it was a big one that was going to fire off the next morning, and I just couldn't sleep, and I'm like, there's got to be something, because it was a really long one. And turns out that the name of the theater was Theatre, and of course I spelled it Thereter. So the next morning I get an email that I was like, oh, you can try to cross every T and dot every I and get the facts that are like what you think like are really the facts, and then something like that will come in, and then while it's correct that it's incorrect,
Yeah,
it's
right.
just like, oh,
Yeah, I call it stepping into mud puddles. The world sets up
Yeah.
mud puddles for us to step in every
that's
day.
the one that gets you.
And I call blind spots.
Well, you see your
And
own
you don't
stuff.
see the thing over your
Yeah.
shoulder. And
One newspaper I was at, I actually had control of it front page, so I started putting corrections on the lower front page. So that was kind of a neat idea, just to kind of this full disclosure, we made this mistake. One mistake I made in the headline once was a nursing home won an award, and I put the nursing home names are similar, and I put the other nursing home in town instead of the one that actually won the award. And somebody called me up saying, you did that because that's the wealthier nursing home, and you were trying to make the poor nursing home, you didn't want to give them any credit. Well, people sometimes accuse you of bias when you make mistakes, and no, I don't want to make a mistake like that. No way would I do that. So, but people have their mind that you made a mistake on purpose.
So you may have to speculate a little bit, because I know that all of you are not engaged in television news and you don't seem to consume it a lot, but I think a lot of Americans do. And I think there's a lot of pressure put on these 24-hour news stations, Fox, CNN, MSNBC, etc., just to fill time and to get stories out there really, really quickly. And I'm wondering if you can sort of talk about how you feel that they do in getting it right, because we hear a lot of information. I think Fox News probably gets hammered the most that a certain percentage of everything they say every day is wrong. I'm just wondering what your take on that is. Is it different?
Well, I fill it with a lot of analysis. I think you've got the headline, you've got the who, what, when, where, why, and how, and that'll take you about 30 seconds. The rest is and again, this is as a consumer, not as someone who's worked in TV news. So this is just my own observation is the rest of the pie, if the top of the hour is here's what we know, the rest is here's what we don't know, and here's what we're going to offer analysis. And I think there is a value to analysis. And I think NPR does a lot of analysis, whether it's what we call reporter two ways, where you talk to another reporter who's reporting on that. I've done that with Dave, where I'm not going to try to be the expert on an issue he's researched for 3 months in a day. So if he comes out with a big story, the nature is he is the expert on that source. And he's the best person to communicate that to the community. I think you need to use that in small doses. You can't use it every time because then we just become the aggregation channel. But when it comes to TV, I think you have to consider how much of their pie is the facts and what is known versus what is speculation and analyzing what is not known. And that can fill a big portion of the hour.
Yeah, I think the big networks, they pay a price when they make mistakes. They're trying just as hard as whether or not to make them. I don't know how well they police themselves on every little mistake. I just don't have a feel for that. I watched Anderson Cooper try to tell somebody who they were accusing, it was Kellyanne Conway on his program. And it was the dossier coming out of, what was it? It was that British spy, and he released a dossier about Trump and something. And CNN reported that the dossier was being reviewed by the White House. And Kellyanne Conway was telling Anderson Cooper, you guys ran with the dossier story. Some other outlet had gotten it wrong, saying that it, I don't know what their error was, saying it contained truths or something in it was correct. And all CNN was doing was saying the dossier was now handed in as a brief to the White House staff or something. And he was trying really hard to make the distinction, the little nuance there, but he was on the hot seat with somebody else at the time.
And there's a lot of cooks at that level. From story start to finish, I have a lot of control over my story. And there's an editor, clearly editor, but from story visioning to on air, there's 2 or 3 people that touch that story. When you get to the bigger and bigger levels, I think there's more editing levels and there's more people that are changing one word or changing one word here. So I don't know if it's like the telephone game where by the end you change it to such a degree that then maybe it becomes misleading. But certainly at the local level, that's why I like working in the market size that I work, because I have a lot of control. But at the end of the day, if there's a mistake, then it's me. It's me.
There was a lot of pressure in 2012 when the Obamacare decision was made by the Supreme Court. CNN, I believe CNN and Fox got it wrong immediately after. They said it ruled against Obamacare, because the first argument that it made was they did rule against it, but then the next argument they said, yeah, they were right, so Obamacare was largely approved. But they were on the air right at that moment, so they said Obamacare was gone because of the Supreme Court. They were wrong, and that's the pressure of being on at the moment. I have a little bit more luxury because I write for a newspaper and I'm online, so I can think of you for a few minutes rather than being right there on live.
I think social media also, for me, is a useful tool to take some of that pressure off of having a scoop. So if I have a big headline that something or other has happened, I can tweet what I do know, and then it's like, okay, I'm on the board, you know, it's out there that we have it, and then that our listeners know we're actively working on it, but then we can slow down and get it. So I think before it's like the scoop would be you'd have the full thing and then you would hit publish. Now we can get a nugget out there, our audience knows we're on top of it, and then take the time to get it. So, and we're not in the business of being first. I'm not in a super competitive market either. So if something big happens and the newsmaker does something, there's 1, 2, or 3 reporters, there's not 20 trying to be the first.
Yeah, I've been in newspapers long enough that I can remember working for a print newspaper without a web. So there you had, it was 24-hour work daily. That was up in Minnesota. Now we're writing for the print edition, but we're also writing for the web. And so you can write, you can do updates on the web with smaller nuggets in a way that you wouldn't put in the newspaper. So that final story that goes in the next day will be a longer version with more detail. But at least we can, like you said, tweet, Facebook, it pops up on the web.
And being first is a little bit overrated. People don't go to parties and say, oh, that organization got that story before they did. People don't talk like that, but we talk like that in our industry. So being first, well, it's somewhat important to get news quickly to readers or viewers. It's not the most important thing.
Well, I think about the 2000 election. Fox News decided to call that election for George Bush when nobody else was calling it. Everybody turned into Fox News to watch that story. And that certainly put pressure on the other stations to want to try to call that election too. Speaking of elections, do you think the media, just in general, got the 2016 election right? Not the prediction, but the way in which they covered it?
I don't know. would have been so hard to cover. I mean, everything that was being said, you have to cover what the candidates are saying, right? And even post-election, the media has been criticized for talking about what Trump tweets. But this is the president's tweets. You have to do a story about some of these tweets, you know. I don't know, that's a tough one, you know, because I think the challenge was they were reporting on Hillary's emails and reporting on Trump's wild day-to-day misdirected quotes, you know. I don't know.
We have the luxury, because we're part of a larger network and we're a member station, we do the local side of it. So there's certain trends that are going to be different in terms of how a particular candidate is doing within our listening area. And that's not biased, it's here's the election numbers and here's how many people voted. That might be different than other states. So, you know, Illinois, typically, we had a pretty good idea how Illinois was going to vote, and in our region, historically from how they voted. The advantage we have is we pipe into NPR, which has reporters on each campaign. So our listeners get the benefit of hearing from reporters that are on the ground with those campaigns. That takes the pressure off of me having to explain what's happening nationally. My job is just to get a pulse of what's happening within the own listening area, and that's something a little easier to control. So when you say, as you look back at the election coverage, well, there was a lot that was incorrectly polled, if you follow the polls, but that was done at a national level, and yes, it was our overall reputation as people listening, because when they listen to the radio, they don't necessarily care if it's me doing local or the morning person, they're just hearing a voice come out of it. But what I do control is continuing to talk to the people literally that are living in our area that we serve.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of people are criticizing the media for like getting it wrong, like everybody said Hillary would win, and the polls said that. But, and then they said, you know, we in the media should have gone to Wisconsin and Ohio more and got the polls there. But if you look at the statements from Trump and you look at the statements even from organizations that are allied Trump, the NRA, the large expectation was that Hillary was going to win. I mean, even Trump was sounding like Hillary was going to win. So to say that the media is alone on that is unfair criticism in my mind.
Yeah, I think I was thinking more than just did they get it right in predicting the outcome of the election, but in the coverage of the election, I think there was a lot of questions about false equivalencies and in that election. So I was sort of thinking along those lines.
Yeah, I think, people felt the media, and I'm talking about the national media. The national media felt an obligation to report on what Hillary was. And they bounced between that and crazy things Trump said. That was basically the coverage. And where were the issues? We watched debates, and issues would surface, substantive issues, but they would just get tidal wave, washed away from within 12 hours or 24 hours from the latest on the email scandal, WikiLeaks, and something Trump said. If Trump had a strategy, I mean, I don't know if it was intentional, but boy, he kept the ball moving. You couldn't really focus.
Well, and I think that's part of the question continuing today. Are they still playing the media? Because it does seem as that there's a lot of stories, a lot of talk about Russia, a lot of talk about the gaffes by Sean Spicer and Kellyanne Conway, and that seems to be grabbing so much of the headlines as opposed to the individual pieces of legislation, the individual executive orders that Trump is putting out that have real consequences for real people, the environment. Are they still playing the media?
Well, there's the insatiable appetite we have now through social media, and so you're seeing where there is demand, there's going to be supply. And what we've talked about today is the difference between the supply and demand. We've got such a high demand, and there's not a huge supply of people doing what we do for different reasons. That difference in gap, I think, is going to be filled with some of that fake news and fabricated news, or news that for people who want to get into that space because they know people are hungry for these headlines or these angles, or who wore what at the inauguration or whatever. The demand is there, and there's only so many people to supply it. So I think some people, some opportunists, see this as a space that they want to play in.
And she's right. I mean, like even in our newspapers, Will Weekend, no secret there, that Will Weekend right now is struggling. And there are groups out there that are producing content, like the Illinois News Network is an arm of the Illinois Policy Institute, and they produce stories that are relatively good, but they have a point of view for conservatives, and there have been a number of papers around the state that have taken those stories. In fact, maybe we did it one time, I have no idea, but I don't think our paper did, but a lot of papers have. And the problem with that is that, first off, if you do run it, you should say what the organization is. The Illinois News Network sounds really great, but it's not that. I mean, it's coming with a point of view, but they know that we need content, we need stories. So get us that. We need to get some more stories, and so we are weak in that point, and people are taking that kind of thing.
And there's unlimited real estate online now. It's not the newspaper margins or just the radio news holes we have to fit. The website and Twitter is we've got as much space as we can possibly fill, and people would click as much as they want to click all day, all night.
One of the things with the polls, there was a post-election story by experts, polling experts, that showed they looked at the 13 major polls going into the election. 12 of those polls, given the margin of error, would have shown that Trump had a chance to win. So it's not that the polls were that off. That was a little misreporting there. That polls weren't that off. If you take, it did show Hillary winning, but if you take, you guys know what a margin of error, if it's plus or minus 5%, that means it could be 5% the other way, which would have given Trump a chance to win. What happened was the media jumped on board and just said, Hillary will win. I think that was an error.
Do you fear that the mainstream news is going to be just relegated to policing fake news? That it's just going to take over and your job is just going to be to sort of struggle to say, this isn't real, this isn't real, this isn't real?
Yeah, I think a big fear is news literacy, and that's with the younger generation. All generations, really. News literacy is something that should be taught and respected, and it's not taught in schools. It's one of those things that it's not on a written exam. So that is something that there is a tide that's very heavy that we're constantly working up against. And I don't have any better radar than other people in the community too. I mean, I get duped too. So it's you see that is going to be something that's creeping up. I think it's something we're up against.
We were all talking back here in the corner, and you have to remember we consume a lot of news, plus we produce news, so we kind of know what news looks like. There's a lot of this news. I don't want to shift all the blame on the readers, but we all share in the blame from the sender to the news. We're all part of this mix. There's a good deal of the public that needs to be news literate. And I wrote down one thing from the, this was mid-October, pre-election. You guys know Alex Jones and InfoWars got quite a bit of press. That's shocking, because I was aware of Alex Jones and InfoWars 2 years ago. I never would have thought he would have crawled out of a dark cave. And if he did, anybody would put a mic in front of him. Now he is. And he had a story that Hillary was actually a demon. Now I'm not making this up. It's hard to believe. Hillary Clinton is actually a demon. Now from our world, we're in, if we see that, I don't want to read anymore. I don't need to read anymore. 40% of Trump voters read it and believed it. So that's two things. They believed Hillary was a demon. Not only that, they believe there's demons. What level of consumer is operating here, right?
I think that's
40% of Trump voters.
I think that's what makes this career a career, because I do feel like it is a crusade of sorts to talk about civic engagement. It's not necessarily a glamorous career. It's got very strange hours. It doesn't have great pay, but it's something I do because at a local, for example, typically I'm not going to be on the campaign trail with the presidential candidate. I'm going to be on a Tuesday night sitting in a city council meeting or covering a mayor's race and sitting in a 3-hour debate between a race, and 3 of those candidates aren't going to win. I see it as a use of my time because it will help me understand better the community that I live in, and it will make me want to live in that community. And I believe that that is a worthy cause, even if it's just one person or the same 20 people who are in that room every time for school board or city council or whatever it is. The hope is that people will get fatigued from the fake news or the fabricated news and will want to go back to civil discourse.
And we're also facing an army of PR folks who have a lot of time and frankly get more money than we do. I mean, a lot of people, and I don't blame them, they better themselves and they better their economics, but they put out stuff and there's fewer of us foot soldiers. So sometimes you gotta decide what's the best use of our time. Should I spend a little more time investigating this story, backing it up, or do I go to a Marcellus City Council meeting? What's going to be better for readers? And sometimes investigating what that politician is saying is probably more important than going to the Marcellus City Council or any city council, because you've got to serve readers first and make sure they get the truth.
So before we turn it over to the audience for questions, I'd like to give you an opportunity to tell us a time that you got a story right and why you're proud of getting that story right.
I'll start off with that. My proudest story I've ever done was heard a couple of people, just average people in town where I was in New Mexico at the time. I grew up in Illinois, but I spent many years in New Mexico. They told me that they had this big party at the school district, a big party, $10,000. Half the money went to a school board member's restaurant. So I did a public records request, and I said, I want to know about the party at the school board member's restaurant, and they said, we have no records to show that this happened, so there's no responsive records. Well, my sources told me, no, the party was catered by that restaurant, so they used a little out that wasn't held at the restaurant. They knew what party. So I did the request again, and I said, I want quotes from all the restaurants that competed with the school board member. Well, it turns out I got the records when I did the request right, and I called the other restaurants, and I said, did you give a quote for this? No, I said it was a $5,000 job. I said, would you remember being given a chance? You're darn right, that's a big job for us. So basically, they made up records that make it look like there was an honest competition for the school board member. Plus, they spent $10,000. I think it ended up being federal funds, federal bilingual funds, and ultimately, the woman, the bilingual director of the bilingual program, she was convicted of corruption associated with that. We did get that story right, but at the very beginning, people were throwing some pretty harsh accusations, and they even said at one point, by doing this, you're being anti-Hispanic by doing these stories, and that was in Northern New Mexico at the time. But ultimately, most of our readers appreciate it because we exposed corruption, but we faced some pretty harsh letters to the editor.
I don't do as much investigative reporting, and so for a story to be right for me, it means that I didn't use my own knowledge or expertise to try to prove or disprove something. I think the perfect story for me is if I go to someone and I say, what should I know about this topic? And then they tell me, and then they tell me, you should talk to this person. Then I go to that person. This topic, you should talk to this person. I did a story, obviously one of the big topics now is heroin use and drug overdoses. So I was like, how do I tell this story? Oh my gosh. Well, I started with the coroner. And the coroner was like, you know what, you should talk to this mom. I've interacted with her, so I went to that mom, and she goes, man, you should talk to this person. She's really been through it. And then I went to that, and then by the time I got to the last person, you should talk to the coroner. And I thought, okay, that means that it's a full circle thing, and that's when it feels like you get the story right.
Yeah, there was a story I did with Kevin Caulfield. Some of you may remember Kevin, he's since passed. I teamed up with him about, I don't want to say it was a local community boy, I started throwing names out. It was a project, a prominent project, where publicly great things, behind the scenes, stiffing contractors, and contractors were walking away from the project. And a lot of money, a lot of reputation around it. But yeah, I think that there's a lot of stories that I end up being proud of. I think most of it, are. One of your questions, I think, got to that, man, is the tools what tools and resources. And when we can use all those tools, like enough time, never have enough time, enough sources, data and reports are great. They don't have feelings. You don't have to wait till you get them on the line. If you get data or reports, that can reveal what you need. And multiple lines of evidence, not more, more than one source confirming what you're looking for.
All right, so we're going to do about 30 minutes of audience questions. So if you have a question, raise your hand, raise it big and high so I can see you. And yes, sir.
I'm kind of curious, your respective newsrooms, how you get a story assigned to you, and who starts deciding, or the bull session in the morning or at the end of the day, what's going to happen tomorrow, and you're going to do this, and we want you to cover this angle, and then along that line of stuff.
We have a morning meeting about 8:15. All the reporters are in the newsroom about 7:30. Now see, we're an afternoon newspaper, so that's unusual. I've worked the other one where it's a morning newspaper. And in a morning newspaper, you're starting your day a little later in the morning and then wrapping things up at about...
So press time for the News Tribune, it goes to press when?
We're done in the newsroom at about 10:30, 11 o'clock. I think 11 o'clock is the last call. And then it's going to the layout and press. But there's a morning meeting to get your specifically how to story. We have a budget, a daily budget, and we try to find out what everybody's working on, and we have a board, and stories. We get some stories that we had planned. We not. That's a maybe that's an inside story now. We don't have a photo. Some stories pop up. We're always changing our budget. We call it a story budget. It's the week's day, the days of the week.
Our first day part is, I used to do this for a long time, it was mornings, you have to be there at 3:45. Now I do afternoons. So So that was because the most listened to time is drive times. So 7 o'clock in the morning in radio is when people are driving. So that's the hot ticket time. So when I was a producer there, is 3:45 to about noon was the day. Now I do separate day parts. So we have our staff is splintered a little bit like that, but they have a 9 o'clock meeting to say, here's what we know is happening today. Maybe if it's a public hearing or a press release, or if it's an enterprise story, and then we have a weekly meeting with the full news staff. And so it's a mixture of the managing editor saying, hey, I've been looking at newspapers, I see they're doing this, what do you think about following up on this? Or it's a mixture of, me taking, that's the thing I don't have. The tool is, when I have time just to sit and just scroll through things, I can come up with good enterprise story ideas. That's the part where it's really hard to just sit and get those good story ideas. But yeah, there's a daily meeting for some of the reporters, and then there's a weekly one where we meet, and then we talk about what stories we're working on, or hey, did you hear they're going to do this, or did they ever finish the constructions on that building? Oh, I'll call them and follow up. So we have a small newsroom, but we have a pretty large newsroom when it comes to a radio market our size. So we're lucky in that respect. But I should also say, most of the people have a second job. So I'm tied to a board going on air every 10 minutes with news and weather in the afternoon. So I report 3 hours a day. I'm tied 3.5 hours a day. 4 hours a day, I'm up and down reading the news. And a lot of people are hybrid like that. So we don't have as many just full-time reporters, which makes it hard to come into a day and finish, just do a day turn, as we call it. Finish one story that you started in the morning. My turnaround might be more like 2 days.
We do have a news budget as well, but we're a little bit more informal as far as meetings. We don't have them very often, and I'm glad for that. So we can. But some of our stories are assigned and some are not. So we're the eyes and ears out there as reporters. So we should be coming up with our own story ideas for the most part. But we do get assigned stories. Yeah, just find out about things going on in the community.
Yes, sir.
How many levels of review and editing do we have? A reporter brings in a story, and how do you separate then, how many levels, fact from opinion of that particular reporter? Now I know in the news media, for the printed word, you've got more time to do that. You get somebody on the radio, and there's no time, because he said it already. And that's a problem of its own. But in the newspaper and possibly on TV, how many levels review and edit a story to make sure that it's fact?
At least in our case, it's always another set of eyes. So it's 2 to 3 other people. Sometimes we get stories from the Associated Press, which means it's got its own editing level. That once we receive it, we pay for that service. Once we receive it, I can go right on with it because it's got its own editing process done in Springfield or Chicago or whatever. If it's something we locally produce, by the time I read it, the reporter has gone through it, the managing editor has gone through it, and maybe another colleague has gone through it.
Yeah, go ahead.
Oh, yeah, I think we have about 2 or 3 people read the stories. One paper I was at, the pressman, sometimes the pressman will actually read the stories, on the negatives, and I really appreciate that. I've been at a place like that because my philosophy is the more eyes, the better. So if the pressman's reading it, at least for the major things, but we've got a mistake in the headline. Hey, thanks, I appreciate you doing it because it's not his job, and some pressmen actually go that far as to do that.
But when I was in Minnesota at a newspaper, we and the reporters, it didn't go beyond us. We called the process the sieve. It wasn't good. And so it got better. They had copy editors, and copy editing got better, and those levels of eyes got better. So the reporters up there, we would proof each other's story before it went to the copy editor. Now at the News Tribune, the reporters proof each other's stories. The editors have already seen it once. Then it'll go back to the editor. It's hard to say how many people are actually going through it. I'd say 2 or 3. It seems like 2 or 3 sets of eyes are getting on it. But I think most reporters then, they know that once it gets beyond the reporter, the level of scrutiny, another person can read it. They don't know what you're talking about. So they're now proofing it for spelling. And so those things that are going to bite you, you got to get right in there. Because, the copy editor is not going to know some of the factual things you're recording.
Well, the biggest challenge for us is just one more thing. With radio, a story, I might have an interview I might go to a meeting that's 3 hours long or something like that. The story's 45 seconds. I have to distill it down into 45 seconds. So there is an editing process, but you're not having to read pages and pages of my notes. The story is there's features which are 3.5 to 5 minutes, but the spot news as you hear in the morning, the news reports, they're 45 seconds, no longer than a minute, just for my understanding. Now the web posting can be longer, but that's the difference I would say in broadcast is we have to write very short, very subject, verb, object, and 10 words or fewer per sentence. And so that can be a challenge, but it can be easier to edit probably. Yes, sir.
Candidate Trump indicated that he was not going to release his taxes because he was under audit. The last couple of days, President Trump's economic advisor says he has no intention of releasing his taxes. 2 statements. Is it the newspaper's job to report those 2 statements, or is it the newspaper's job to point out that there is in fact a contradiction between those 2 statements?
Well, part of reporting is capturing a moment in time and having that for historical record. So if something is said, we're reporting on this was said at this time. If something else is said, so the question is it our job to put those 2 together in one space?
Point out to your audience that in fact there are contradictions.
In one space.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, we just did that the other day with a story on Congressman Kinzinger. Actually, we've done 2 stories lately on Congressman Kinzinger about things he said before, like town halls. He really believed in holding them. He criticized his predecessor for not holding very many, and now he's not holding very many. Just like her, it was during the healthcare debate then, it was during the healthcare debate now. It was very equivalent circumstances, and we pointed out. I mean, yes, the answer is absolutely yes. I think if you know about it, now sometimes there's not historical knowledge, maybe in the newsroom to know, but if you know about it and it seems like it's a contradiction, you point out the statement now and you point out the statement before. I almost think if you don't do that and you know about it, then you're not doing your job.
I think that's happening pretty rigorously right now. I'd have to say that President Trump, I mean, We're looking at everything he said during the election, after the election, what he said last month versus this month. It seems like they're doing a lot of those. However, I will give politicians the opportunity to change their mind. And that's what separates us from deer and turtles, right? The deer always, humans are, you know, changing situations, changing environments, changing funding. Anything politicians should be able to change their mind. And we should give them the opportunity to do that with an explanation. You know, they need an explanation of why they changed their mind.
Thank you. So this is coming from my new interest in the TV show, The Newsroom, by Aaron Sporkin. What's his name? Early in that series, that news group decides that they're going to start producing what they perceive as important news. And at one point, they come up against a wall where something they see as trivial, shouldn't really be being reported, it's not that important. But they need to get ratings. So do you think that there is a way that we can work on fixing, or we can fix the kind of demand for what we want to hear and what we want to learn about versus what we should be learning about? Because you guys can report the great stuff, but especially during elections and when thoughts are polarized and things, how do you make us learn the good stuff as opposed to, I just want to learn what I want to learn about. I want to hear what I want to hear about.
That's like $1 million question.
Junk food tastes better than carrots. Yeah,
Right,
it's
yeah,
true.
exactly.
It's true.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think there's really a good answer for it. You have to provide kind of what your people want to read or view, but you kind of have to produce what they need. But then again, I remember this. I know this is going way back, but I remember when the Lewinsky report came out, this kind of Star report came out in '98. Boy, the internet almost shut down when that report came out. I mean, people, everybody you talk to people, they say, I don't care about that stuff. That's not important. But boy, I'll admit, I went to that report online. Yeah, I probably said that to a few people. Oh, this is just a big distraction, you know. But then you want to see what is in the report, So I don't have a good answer to that. Maybe these guys do.
I don't think we can legislate that either. I mean, I told you I go to people.com on who wore it best. I mean, I for my own, I have to decide for myself how I want to balance my consumption, other people. But I think offering an option with the carrots and offering what I think there's a story this week I got assigned to the National Soil Testing Competition, and it's a group of university students from around the country who are up here in this area. And okay, how do you tell on soil competition? So the way I framed it is I tried to frame it in terms of March Madness, and I called it Mud Madness. Because the listeners, what I tried to do is I had my own fun with it, and I thought, well, if I'm having fun creating this, hopefully people are having fun hearing it. These students are sure having a heck of a time doing this, and so, this is a moment in time, they're having a good time. How do I communicate this to an audience? So I think as a reporter, you have to have fun, not take yourself too seriously sometimes. But there's also information and there's journalism. We take information and make it journalism. That's a very creative funnel process. And so that's where I hope the flair comes from, that then the audience and the reader will read that in addition to other fluff that may be out there.
Yeah, it used to be that you get feedback from readers on the phone, or a letter to the editor, or you hear it on the street. Now we get instant feedback. It clicks on our website. Tell us what readers want. And they're not clicking on the 30-inch story about county boards, I can tell you that. They're clicking on crime stories. They're clicking on the missing woman, car chase. Those are the stories they're clicking on. But we know that if we give up that hard news, that whole mix, we're gonna lose our readers, because they're gonna want the whole mix. And I should say, hold the mainstream press accountable, but don't give up on them, because without them, I wanted to say something earlier about the tagline, fake news. You can see what's happened. It was real fake news, we've already defined that. The manipulators of this, including our president, took that name and misappropriated or reappropriated it to the mainstream without any explanation. That's what's happened. So there's fake news, there's fake news. Just throw that aside. But they've taken that tag and applied it to the mainstream with the motivation of discounting us. So if you take us out of it, what do you have? You have state-run news. You're going to get it straight from the White House. Yeah, you're going to have state-run news.
And not saying as individuals, you know, it's blanketing any one entity or organization, but not saying that the individuals are working.
Right. But your question though, that's a good question. That it's tough because those clicks tell us what you want or what people, those are the money makers, but we know, you know, so we try to mix it up. I remember a story I wrote up in Minnesota about somebody who found a squirrel in a road. I mean, this was a big, people love this story. It was 10 inches long. I didn't even have to embellish it. I just told the story of what happened. 2 women found the squirrel, it was injured, they took it to a vet and paid $400 to get its bones fixed. Its leg. With a pin. They had a pin and they had a picture of the squirrel with a little cast on its leg.
Yes, sir.
So I get up in the morning, every morning. I click on Reuters, I click on Bloomberg, go to New York Times, then I go to the BBC. Then I'm shopping the BBC, I'm skeptical.
It's a very legitimate news source. BBC's.
I'm skeptical.
What makes you skeptical?
Where does the U.S. media get all their stories?
I think what he's suggesting is that if the BBC isn't reporting on it, that maybe we're sort of selling a story that isn't as important as it might be. Is that what you're suggesting? Yeah.
Well, of course, BBC is across an ocean, so maybe a story that's not so big here is not going to make it there. But
Your squirrel story probably wasn't on BBC.
Yeah,
Probably not. But they did do some traveling.
Although BBC is a great news source.
I think you raise a good point, though, and that you can oftentimes get a different angle on what's going on in American politics if you look at it from a foreign source. I really miss Al Jazeera News. I thought they did a really good job of Al Jazeera America, of portraying politics and issues from a perspective that some of the mainstream sources weren't. So it's still available, it's just not as available as it was before. So.
I think that's part of news literacy, I think, is looking at just the myopic view of how, well, I don't think that there is a conspiracy in the media on how we tell. There is a cultural way that we tell stories. Again, I don't do national stories, so, but sometimes I go to CBC to see the stories in Canada, just to see, like, how do they write different? How do they tell that? So I think that's a useful exercise in being news literate.
I think you're doing the right thing.
Yeah.
Because I've noticed it, especially when the U.S. is at war, get out of the country and read. You'll get a different take on citizen casualties or things that weren't, reported heavily in the United
They're not blocked for us, so we're very lucky in this country that we can do that.
Yes, sir.
As far as ascertaining a politician's position on any issue, what do you think of Vote Smart? Or are you familiar with it?
I've heard it, but I don't want to comment on it because I don't remember what its orientation is.
I think the Ballotpedia
That's
and
the one
Vote, Ballotpedia and Vote Smart and some of those websites are really helpful because they're not really news agencies, but they're kind of doing fact checking.
It's like a Wikipedia
Info.
almost.
Yeah.
It's a good secondary, tertiary source where that's where you're starting to see that. I think of Ballotpedia or whatever. A lot of times that might be the third or fourth one to verify. Okay.
Yes.
I wanted to follow up on his thought thread that your grant that you girls got up for us to see these 4 episodes, did it fulfill what the grant wishes? That are we grasping what we're supposed to out of the money spent for this and to capture, be more diagnostic of the news out there and be better voters? And are we being good consumers of this effort?
I'll take that one.
Okay.
As one of the people who wrote the grant for this program, I think that, first of all, we've had an excellent turnout at each of the 4 events, and it's been growing each time. And we've received a lot of feedback after that, and a lot of things on the evaluations, which we take seriously, so please fill yours out. I think that anytime we talk about issues, whether it's pro or con from each of our own individual points of view, it's important. And especially in a public forum where we're talking about matters that make a difference to the public good, I think it's important. And you know, I was thinking to myself while I was standing in the back that there is this appeal for a lot of reasons about social media news and about all of the various aspects of fake news. And you know, we all like to be reaffirmed in our position about it. So there is a lot of kind of social appeal of being involved in those kinds of news sources. News, I use that really loosely. Sources that provide us with information. But I know what our panel has said here and what some of the other people have said is that the burden is on all of us as consumers of news to get it right. And for people who are my age and down to the youngest person in this room, it's important that we take news literacy seriously. And in the schools, I see middle schoolers, I do work in the schools now, and I see middle schoolers who are constantly challenged by their teachers to use their critical thinking skills. And that's the beginning, I think, in learning news literacy. You become a critical thinker in general, and then it builds as an adult, and this is one of the areas I think that you can use those skills.
I saw in our paper, I think the News Tribune said that the Princeton Library was going to do something very similar to this last night. And is somebody from the state pushing this down or they just kind of follow suit?
No, we dream these things up, and you know, if there's a grant opportunity, we try to come up with a good idea, and then we write the application, and either it is granted or it isn't. But
I must say though that news media themselves are really trying to get together. So I went to a conference that I actually got paid to go to a conference and get out of a day of work. I mean, that's like brilliant, right? To go and learn about how to teach this material to students, to community members, etc. There's a lot of professors of journalism, and I was there in political science and had someone from economics and a few other people there. And that was put out by Stony Brook University for their Center for News Literacy, I think it was something like that. And now we have those resources available. So I think that what I'm seeing is that there is a trend. I don't see it coming from the government. I see it coming from news agencies themselves saying, we have a bit of a crisis here, and we've got to do a better job of telling people what it is that we do and how to evaluate sources, so that we don't end up with people saying, you know, this news media story about, I like to tell this one all the time, you know, about Hillary Clinton selling the children out of the pizza store is not real news. And how can we know that that's not real news? Because I think it's snuck up on a lot of people. That, like you said with Jones, you know, that he's been floating around for forever. I don't think anybody ever thought that the President of the United States would be citing him on a somewhat regular basis, and suddenly he is. So I think the news industry itself sees this as something that needs to be done.
Yeah, the journalism industry is always talking about itself like this. Mainstream journalists, we're always having conferences and panels. There was discussion about journalism and its direction and how to serve readers before this recent period of the election of fake news started. Now it's just amped up a bit. I have seen some discussions like what this News and Noise series has done online in other states and other universities are having the same discussions like this. But I should bring up that somebody mentioned the Columbia Journalism Review, but in 2007 they had a really good story about fake news. That was 10 years ago. And one of the quotes in it was, are we prepared, this is 10 years ago they said this, are we prepared for the global 24/7 fake news cage match that will dominate journalism in the 21st century? Even then, they were seeing this trend in the web and the pervasive nature of false and fake news.
And I think the ultimate testament to situations like this is that people are interested in seeing behind the curtain of what we do, because this is just what I do. I don't often have to, I just do it. It's just what my job is. And so when there's interest, not only does it help us feel relevant, it's like, okay, I'm not just talking to my people care and people engage and people agree and people disagree. That's important to me as a person, that's important to me as a profession. If people are interested in seeing really how it works, there's no secrets. And it's not really, there's no secret meetings or anything like that. So I appreciate any opportunity to interface with people who have questions.
You know, I saw a hand over here out of the corner of my eye. Did I not? Was it you?
Yes. I would, just since the question was raised, I'm here from Reaching Across Illinois Library System, who awarded the grant for this series of programs. And we're a system that supports libraries in the northern half of Illinois. So this grant was not focused on one particular topic. This was a grant awarded to a number of libraries that did different programs, and really the heart of it was being a collaborative effort, and this was a collaboration between LaSalle Public Library and here IVCC. And you know, the topic they picked was picked because it is important to the community. It's what people are talking about, and libraries want to be responsive. So that's kind of what our rationale was in funding this and some of the grants that we did. The question I was going to ask to you all, and thank you all for being here. Just in general, the kind of fake news phenomenon, when it became a thing, and going forward, do you think ultimately you'll look back and say it was a good or bad thing for mainstream media? And I guess what I mean by that is, you know, on the one hand, I could see there being now people who are skeptical of journalism in general. But on the other hand, I can see people saying, maybe I shouldn't rely on that link that I saw in my cousin's, timeline on Facebook, and I should turn to a more established media outlet. So, I'm just curious.
Maybe a silver lining.
Yeah.
It's not good, but, well, it seems to me that the more I read about this, I read the 1903 headline. We keep doing this. We keep in these periods where we're generating. There's always somebody out there trying to get the wrong word out, motivated by something. Back in the yellow journalism days, it was this literally drove us to war in the late 1800s. They made up headlines to do it. They were too good, and the Spanish American War. And then I know Snopes. People now rely on Snopes a lot. You got to remember, Snopes started in 1995. I think it started for a reason, because there was so much what they call urban legends, or there's so many words for it. We seem to keep doing this, but I think it goes back to media literacy, and we're going to have to start refereeing ourselves. I've just gotten a little bolder talking to my friends. I respect the person, but there's one conservative quote from, what's his name? Ben Shapiro that I like to use. Facts don't care about your feelings. We do. We don't want to offend anybody. But we need to start having more respect for facts. And I tell my friends, my circle of friends, even online, the best way I can, that's not right. It's not true.
And we share the same space with the internet. The internet wasn't created to be, it was created to be what it is and what it's become. And so just because, if you turn on the radio, you get our side verse universe. If you go to the internet, you get our universe and then everything else. And again, I'm not in the business of policing that, and I believe in the First Amendment. And so I think that they can share the same spaces And it's a good thing. Silver lining is a good term.
We just need to get rid of the words fake news. I mean, it's just been hijacked the term. Maybe, like you think you said, fabricated stories, that might be the best way to say it, because fake news, it really means nothing anymore. If I read a story and I'm angry, now that's fake news. You know.
It's like organized religion to me. It's a blanket term, and the closest I can think of to compare it to.
It's tough though, because, I mean, freedom of speech has to win. If freedom of speech will win, we can't be snuffing voices and muzzling people. So that's it.
You know, I don't know if I agree with that. I grew up in the Andy Taylor days, you know, and Mayberry RFD,
Yeah,
and
so did I.
now we got all these killing cop shows all over. I think it affects the brain. So I'm not sure. I know we need free speech, but I think that the censors of old days maybe had a point to be here.
I hear what you're saying. We know we don't want certain things, certain headlines. Some of the information, there's no value to it. It has a value of 0. If you could put a meter to it, it would read zeros. It wouldn't even read a .01, right? There's just
in your powers,
information.
You say,
but however, you have to remember that public shaming done a lot before. They never had the motivation to step out into the light and say this stuff. So something's changed in our society.
Are you ever worried about creating copycat killings and copycat bombings and stuff like that?
I think what he's saying when you report on something like you have a high school shooting and then this kid says, I saw this kid and he did a shooting and got all this attention, and so do you fear that you're replicating that? And then after that I gotta go to other people.
Well, we're being more gun shy about putting the photos of people. I think the murder in that elementary school, I don't think the media put the murderer's face mugshot in the paper too often, or you didn't see it too often. Almost like the media, national media was pulling back on that kind of thing. So I don't think that's a bad thing.
I have a student here who wanted to ask a question. Go ahead.
Okay. So I was too young to remember the Iraq invasion in which we overthrew Saddam Hussein. However, from what I've been told, the media was very much pro-war, generally speaking, in terms of propagating what the administration wanted to say, and then basically doing the whole brouhaha jingoism thing, generally speaking, in which we went through, which promoted the whole war thing. And of course, as I think we all can, for the most part, agree with, it wasn't exactly the best decision we ever made. Of course, recently, with the missile strikes in Syria by the Trump administration, with the whole missiles and bombing the Syrian air base, from what I've seen, we sort of seen that resurgence in which basically all the Trump criticism for that day at least ceased to exist. And it was pretty much that same sort of promotion of war, so to speak, of this conflict, in which even one, I forget who I think it might have been Brian Williams, but one newscaster quote said, when the missiles were struck, he quote said they were beautiful. Now personally, I don't sexually am attractive to missiles, but I mean that's his choice. However,
talking about the Syrian missile?
Yes.
Yes.
Beautiful. Yeah. But basically, my broader question would be: do you think the media is doing a good enough job to be the watchdog of the government?
The media is an awful lot of, the media is a term that's an entity that's not me. I'm one person. And what I do is local journalism. And yeah, those are not the stories that I'm covering. And I know people are interested in those, and I know that they're voting on a president. But my role in my community, to my audience, is at the local level. Do you know who the mayor deciding your ordinances are? Do you know how much your teachers are getting paid? Those are the things that I think get lost with the national media, and I think it's important and critical for people to pay attention and stay on top of those things and make sure they're getting the right sources on that. But I would say, in addition to those issues, are you paying attention to the local journalism? Because that's where you can be part of change at a real level. And I think that there's very hardworking professionals at those levels that, yeah, that's the top of the pyramid, those types of stories. As a member of the media, I'm not there. I'm not at that level. But
Well, you would have covered Dennis Hastert, though.
yeah, he was in our area, and I was in Springfield when Rod Blagojevich was arrested. So there's different levels there. I guess as part of news literacy, where I would take that question to the big picture here is news literacy includes what's happening in your own backyard too, and understanding how people live in civil society in your own community. And it can help you understand better how people are reacting to the outcome of a presidential election or the first 100 days of a presidency and what's accomplished or what's not accomplished. That's not my job, but I think that news literacy includes all of those things.
And hurrah for support your local media. Don't want them to go away. All of the newspapers, the radio, your regional newspapers, some way support them. But I know with the Iraq War, I mean, there was a lot of patriotic fervor and a drumbeat after 9/11. And I think that's what the media got caught up in. And I think later on, I think that's what you're speaking to, this national war, the feelings that, I don't think that same feeling is present with the missile strikes from Syria. But
it's,
I can only,
yeah,
I can only tell you what I see happen.
to your point is getting, the way we can approach that locally is what we call man on the street. It's going to people and finding out how they feel about it. It doesn't matter what I feel about it. What do people in your community feel like? So with healthcare or things like that, our role here on the panel would be to get the pulse of what do people feel here, instead of what I feel or what they feel. And I think that we do that. Right now we're doing a 100 Days project where we're going to different people and finding out, what does 100 days mean? Was it successful? Was it not? How do you determine what would be success and not? Our job is to put out those critical thinking questions and let the public answer, put those together, and then that's what we can offer. What I believe is the best service to our listeners.
On the, back 100 years ago, I took a course in technical report writing, and we had something called the fog index. And the fog index was a combination of looking at a paragraph and saying, like you mentioned earlier, how many polysyllable words are there in there, and how many sentences are there in this paragraph, and how many words the sentence. What education, and we had to write our reports then to the, based on that fog index, to a certain educational level. And we took newspapers and we analyzed the newspapers and saw the educational level that the newspapers were writing to. I don't recall exactly what it was, but do you still do that somehow? Do you write to a certain educational level? You mentioned the audience earlier about maybe not doing their part. Could it be that maybe they don't understand what you're saying, or you understand what I'm saying?
I can take this one. Well, I write to a level that people can understand, and that's good writing. I mean, some people say, oh, are you talking down to the audience? No, I do try to use words that are simple, concise, clear, and actually the way I tell a story, I mean, I think most reporters are like me, is you tell a story, like you tell the guy next to you in the bar, or the person next to you in church. You maybe a slightly more elevated than how you'd say it, but that's kind of how the words you should use. You should speak to people. If you look at some of the best writing, it's usually one-syllable words, not those long syllable, those multi-syllable words your English teacher might have liked in high school.
We try to write conversationally. That's the buzzword we use. Is how would you tell your mom? If you covered something and you call her up and go, hey, I just covered this meeting, yeah, the mayor's going to resign. Then sit down and start typing it. Don't start typing and then it's real bureaucratic and then you go home and tell your roommate, this happened. How would you start there?
Yeah.
But you don't write to an educational level.
No, we write for everybody to understand. You guys are all here. I mean, you look like a good cross-section of the public. We would want everybody here to be able to understand that story. That means plain language. Now, the challenge for us is we've been at this, so we know how to write plainly. The challenge is to take things that government is kicking out, which isn't written in plain language. It should be. That's been my argument to government, because some of these documents are public documents. Well, John and Joe, you know, Jane and John Doe walk in and read that, they wouldn't have a clue. It should be read, it should be written in a way that they can understand. It's often not. So our challenge often is to take this language, this kind of technical language, over-technical sometimes, ridiculous. Some of it's ridiculous.
Legalese or jargonese.
Yeah, it's terrible.
I'm general
And to translate
assignment.
it.
Yeah, every day it's like, I'm not an expert in any of these things. I don't try to be an expert in those. So if I'm talking to an expert who knows it, I just say, work with me here. I mean, okay, I'm sorry, I really don't get it. If you were trying to explain this at a dinner party, like, I said this to someone the other day, I said, someone was trying to explain their major in school. I said, okay, when you go home for spring break and you tell your grandma what you're doing here in college, what do you tell her? And he's like, oh, I'm going to make money. And I said, okay, now we're getting somewhere. Now tell me a little bit more about that. Because you got to explain it to me so that I can explain it. And that takes starting at the expertise level, and they're going to speak their language. We always say, yeah, legalese or whatever. Okay, help me explain it because I got to understand it.
That's probably the toughest bias to shape. You know, at the level, what we work at day in and day out, just work-a-day journalism, the bias is not to adopt that language. And it just drips in from every source. I was writing about administrative adjudication. Anybody know what that is? I wouldn't expect you to know. That means the city is handling low-level crimes before a hearing officer at City Hall. But I had to give it a tag and then explain it. Administrative adjudication. Wow. The word facility makes me cringe.
Oh, yeah.
Facility.
Yeah, that's exactly the word. I do use it sometimes.
We were just talking about this in the newsroom about the splash pad. So we were making up a term. We were doing it in reverse. This is what a splash pad is, cruising to build a splash pad. So in reverse, we were re-engineering what a government might call it. I think we had recreational aquatic facility. We were just joking, but we spent a lot of our time cutting through the government language, and we get so much of it. That's probably the biggest bias, is just unconsciously adopting this way of talking, because we talk to so many sources and read so many documents that use this kind of language.
In our newsroom, we have a sign that says, like, why should I care? Not specifically people. If I go up to someone, why should you care?
So what?
Yeah, so what?
Yeah.
I know that we're getting close to the end now, and there's still a couple of hands. We do have to vacate this room in less than 10 minutes. There's another reservation on it. I wanted to make sure we covered everybody, so think of your questions before we go. While you're thinking, I wanted to ask our panel one question of my own, which is, I'm on your side. I would love to restore the days where I could turn on the TV and I could love Walter Cronkite. What can you all do to make us all love mainstream media again?
I guess we write great stories every day. It's what we're trying to do.
Speak for the people, get around the government jargon you were just talking about, and speak to the people, like, uncover things.
Yes, sir.
I've got a whole list that I won't ask you. I just got one statement. Dooley defeats Truman.
Right.
They corrected that quickly.
But at the time, Dewey was defeating Truman probably when they put the headline.
And I've probably got the copies from my former relatives of that newspaper.
If it's the actual, it's probably worth something.
I'm hoping so.
1948, or what was that year? 48?
I think it was.
Chicago, right?
Yeah.
Yes, sir.
In the same breath that you criticize the government for its obfuscation of everything, you also have to criticize the corporations. Did you ever try to read an annual report for the publicly traded stock that you were invested in?
Oh, yeah.
Make any sense of it?
Financial language.
That's
Right, with crappy language. Yeah,
And
it's almost hidden from view.
Yeah, the point of, it's supposed to, the purpose of an annual report is to make it clear to you, the investor, of exactly what's going on. And that is not what is achieved. It's the exact opposite. So corporations are probably just as guilty, private industry is just as guilty as government.
Agreed.
Yeah.
I see we have, let's see, how many reporters do we have here today? Two reporters here today. So I think it would be fun to read how each one of them presents the story tonight from here and see what you find.
Not sure.
Well, that's what I would say. The last thing is, there's the event this is really nice because the event's over, and I'm like, okay. The reporters still have all the work to do. That's the thing. There's the event. I think that's something people understand about reporting is the event itself and all of the back and forth and who said what and getting all those things, and then their day's just starting. It's so far from being done.
And I was just thinking about that. This is one time where I can actually leave a meeting and go home, whereas
I know, it feels good to be on the other side. Yeah, we go to meetings and everybody says, yeah, they're so happy because the meeting's over with and your work is just starting.
Your brain's starting to work.
We do have to wrap it up, so if you could, if you want to talk quickly to them.
Can I see a show of hands of who creates content on the web or writes to the newspaper? Who actually tries to be them?
Oh, well, I do. If you're my friend on Facebook, you will be fact-checked. Just know that.
And I know it's hard. I think it's got to be difficult to do it day in and day out, 8 hours a day. It's got to be hard.
Please, let's give a round of applause for College Library for putting on these programs, and we hope you found them worthwhile. If you've got time to fill out those last surveys, we really appreciate it. If you're a student, I think most of them ran out of here. I was going to tell you to sign in form so we know you were here, but thank you so much and have a good evening. And come see Sweet Charity tomorrow night.